part of our adult Christian education program a couple of weeks ago, 11 of us gathered over 2 Saturdays to explore gifts and passions that we believe come from God. And the program's called The Network, and it was a great kind of fun thing to do together as we kind of discern what is it about us that is unique, the combination of the gifts that God has given us and the skills and the experience that we have and the container that all of that is in, and how do we connect that with the larger picture. How do we serve? How do we use that in the world, whether in our professional lives, in our volunteer lives, or just in our personal lives? And it was a really great adventure. And one of the things I discovered in doing that course was some wonderful YouTube videos by a man that I didn't really know anything about before then. His name is Tom Chi. And Tom Chi, you haven't heard of him probably, but you will have used things that he invented and created. He was very much one of the masterminds behind Windows on the computer, Microsoft Windows. He was a part of the Google X team, so he's very much a kind of innovator, entrepreneur, and has made a huge impact. And he's a very young man. And he's given a couple of talks about life and especially the human brain and our ability to create, and what are the things that stop us creating, what gets in the way. Often knowledge and learning gets in the way. But it's interesting, he's an astrophysicist. And what I found fascinating was that he presented a kind of theological framework for the existence of God from a scientific point of view. And basically what he said was that all of us together, today we're sitting, our hearts are beating. And that is caused because we have iron in our bodies, right? And there's only one place in the universe that iron has come from. A couple of billion years ago, there was this enormous collision of galaxies. And in that explosion, stardust was sent out that created life as we know it, including iron in our bodies. And what he said basically was, science is now telling us that what ancient wisdom, often in the scriptures, all faith traditions have been telling us from the beginning, that first of all, we're all from the same place, we're all connected, and we are eternal. And he talked about us being the stardust, this really valuable stardust, that even in death, we ain't finished yet. That there is something that is transformed and continues to grow. And it was very kind of powerful to hear this from a scientist. And he talks about how do we read and how do we get back to, so often in the Bible, there are many, the Bible's saying the same thing, but often those images that the Bible uses no longer relevant to us, or they're confusing to us. We've come from the same place, we're all connected, and we're all looking to return to that home, that place of home, right? And that our identity and our sense of who we are is tied up with that journey. And Advent is a kind of suddenly we get this sense of we are on a journey homeward, right? And in the reading in Baruch today, it's interesting, you have a community, the Jewish community thousands of years ago in exile in Babylon. They are disconnected from who they really are. And so this longing to return home takes on this beautiful poetic sense. And it's kind of like a Cinderella story, that there will be a transformation, there will be a change of garments. We will wear the crowns and wear the beautiful coiffure as we journey back to Jerusalem. And all of the obstacles, all of the difficulty, that journey through the wilderness, all of those difficulties will be erased. The great bulldozer of God will move the mountains and fill in the valleys, and the highway, the freeway will be straight so that we can go home. Beautiful. And if you're Jewish, the wilderness has many, many powerful symbols. The wilderness is the place where God takes us from the slavery of Egypt, and we have to go through the wilderness to get to the the new homeland, right? And if you're in exile in Babylon, it's the wilderness you have to travel through. You have to travel through the wilderness to get to Jerusalem. And today's gospel opens with another mention of another wilderness. It's a political wilderness. And Luke introduces us to John the Baptist in this very profound way. In the 15th year of the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, an infidel, and here's another infidel who's ruling our country, and here's another infidel, and you get this political corruption that is kind of named in the gospel. And then in the reign of this emperor, and then when such and such was head of the high priest. So you have the political corruption and you have the religious corruption. And into that wilderness, John the Baptist hears the word of God. So the wilderness is taking on a different dimension. And what's fascinating, many of us, we don't really know this character, this John the Baptist character, but he is a profound, significant character. And what's very interesting is we have different sources that tell us more about who John the Baptist really was. We've got the stories in the Gospels, written from a position of faith, that's very much presenting him as the forerunner to Jesus. But we also have a secular kind of first century, it was written around 90 AD, a historian called Josephus, who is a Jew who is trying to help the Roman kind of hierarchy understand what it is, who are the Jews, what do they believe and think. And so in Josephus' history of the Jewish people, John the Baptist is mentioned. And Josephus has enormous respect for him. Josephus he doesn't have much time for a lot of these crazy religious people, these messiahs, but he has enormous respect for John the Baptist, and he records how charismatic he was, how important he was, that he had this enormous following of people, that he was calling people to a righteous, holy life, and that he was a threat to the powers that be, and he was done in. And Josephus records all this. And in fact, Josephus gives John the Baptist much more importance in the history than he does of Jesus. You know? So it's really important in this journey to Advent, as we are looking at our journey home, our journey to God, that this person who becomes the kind of bulldozer of God, that we look at him in a different way. And he is a kind of unexpected arrival. He is not we think of John the Baptist as a kind of hippie, wild, his diet of locusts and wild honey and his coat of camel's hair. He was a kind of early hippie figure, a little crazy. But he was total establishment. His father was a priest of the temple. He would have gone to the best schools of his day. He would have gone to Deerfield and Dalton and Yale and Harvard. He was totally a part of the establishment. Right? Zechariah, the hymn that we read in place of the psalm, was a priest of the temple. And there's this wonderful connection between his mother, who is, again, there's a mystery around his birth because his mother is barren in old age, and she gets word that she's going to have a son, and she's related to this young woman, Mary, they're cousins, and there's a wonderful way in which she becomes the mentor to Mary. And they're both surprised by this news that they're going to have this child in all its wonder and all its fear. And so John grows up in a very privileged world. And it would be assumed if his father was a priest of the temple, he would also be a priest. But there is something about that image of that he's born into the wilderness, the corruption, the religious and political corruption of his day, that he cannot buy into that. And his job as the bulldozer of God is to remove all the obstacles that are stopping us from getting home. and all of the obstacles that political and religious life has created to say we're all different and we're not from the same place, we're not from the same stardust. That John in his being knew there was a different good news, and he came up against the establishment. Right? And we know that there is a community, just in our own days, there are people who, they see the system as corrupt, and so they create an alternative community. And we know a lot about a community called the Essenes. And there were single people, married people, people with children, and they lived on the edge of the city, and they would have created a different kind of culture, a different kind of ethic, where they took care of one another, where they shared all things in common, where there would have been a kind of ethical, social concern for each other, and it was deeply kind of steeped in religious traditions. That baptism was a kind of initiation into this Essene community. And we know that John probably may have been a part of that community, would have been aware of that community. So that's a part of him. But I can imagine two things. One is, what did Elizabeth and Zechariah think of their son? What did they think about him? And as he was having dinner with his friends in the alternative community, what did they think about him? Because he came from the establishment. He came from the people who were in charge of everything. And so he was kind of caught in the middle. And I love that image. Sometimes there are things that, some things we have to learn, we don't learn at home. We have to, Jesus talks about leaving father and mother, and he talks about hating parents, right? And it's that, if you've spent a lot of money in therapy, Jesus cuts to the chase. You've got to cut all that off, and you've got to establish your own identity and who you are and break free and all the pressures of culture and parents and expectations. In John, we see that. We see that. And sometimes, we look at our children. We've given them everything, right? And they don't turn out the way we think they're going to turn out. Or they choose to do things that we might think are a little weird. And John the Baptist is like that. And his message is harsh. His message for many is not good news. It's a kind of condemnation. But it's also a call to this repentance. We confuse that in Christianity with confession of sin. But in John's context, it was about thinking differently. He was saying to people, I want you to think differently about who you are, your journey home to God, and all of the religious and political stuff. Think differently about that. And so he did. He became a leader, and very charismatic, very powerful, and that's why he was done in. He was very effective about helping people to understand that they're all connected, there's a social responsibility, and that they are journeying home to something bigger and larger. So there's a lot in this focus on John the Baptist today. And I was trying to think of, is there someone in our contemporary life that we can get close to and get a sense of what, if John the Baptist was around today, what he might look like? And the person I came up with was Martin Luther King, Dr. King. Somebody who, for his time, was in a very successful, affluent place. As an African American, he was, upper middle class. He was academic. He had everything going for him. And if we read between the lines of the letter to the Birmingham, from the Birmingham jail to the white clergy who wouldn't support him, they're saying basically, well, if you just behaved yourself, kept your mouth shut, being more patient, you might have been alive today. And so I think about Dr. King, that he was somehow, there was something compelling him. He had a different vision of how we can relate to each other. He had a different vision that we're all connected, that we're all from the same place and we're all going to the same place. And he kind of lived that out with all its difficulty for him and his family and his community. And we can understand why he's a threat. We can understand now maybe why John the Baptist was such a threat to both the political and the religious side. I was trying to find a sermon. I would have loved to have found a sermon by Dr. King on John the Baptist, but I couldn't find one. And in many ways, he kind of incarnated that prophetic. He may be, just as John the Baptist was the last of the great Jewish prophets, there's a kind of closing of a chapter with John and the opening of a new chapter with Jesus, And John's death is the signal for Jesus to begin the work. It is John's death that Jesus then recognizes it's now his turn to continue that work. And much of the ethical framework of Jesus, the whole thing about when you help the least of these, my brothers, you're helping me and you're helping God, comes from John the Baptist and the Essene community. So back to Dr. King. I found in 2011 there was a group of clergy who gathered in Birmingham, and they visited many of the places associated with Dr. King and some of the tragedy and some of the success stories from that community. And they said, nobody ever replied to Dr. King's letter to the Birmingham clergy. There was never a response. And so they tried to put together a response to that letter that was written in 1963. And they say this: "We have gathered this week in Birmingham as representatives of the churches and organizations that make up Christian churches together. We came to examine poverty through the lens of racism. After experiences at the Civil Rights Institute and the 16th Street Baptist Church, we have felt compelled to make a response to the letter from a Birmingham jail. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter was an answer to a message from a group of clergy in Birmingham. So far as we know, no one has ever issued a clergy response to Dr. King's letter." And they break their response into three kind of subheadings: remembering, repenting, and renewing. Remembering. We begin by expressing profound gratitude to the leaders of the civil rights movement whose sacrifices have moved us closer to God's justice. Those leaders and thousands who followed their lead accomplished more than many could imagine and demonstrated the power of Christian nonviolent action. We celebrate the remarkable strides made through their courageous witness. Repenting. We recognize, however, that some of us have not progressed far enough beyond the initial message from the Birmingham clergy. Though virtually all our institutions have formal statements against racism, too often our follow-through has been far less than our spoken commitments. Too often we have elected to be comfortable rather than prophetic. Too often we have chosen not to see the evidence of a racism that is less overt but still permeates our national life in corrosive ways. And thirdly, renewing. Though chastened by the unfinished nature of the work before us, we are inspired by the witness we saw reflected in both the history and the present-day ministry of the organizations we visited in Birmingham. Dr. King's letter speaks powerfully to us today, even as it did in 1963. We remember two windows in the 16th Street Baptist Church. One window, the face of Jesus has been blown out as a result of the bomb that murdered 4 girls in 1963. The other window is a gift from the congregation after the tragedy. It depicts a Christ figure who with one hand rejects the injustice of the world and with the other extends forgiveness. In the spirit of this loving Jesus, and in the spirit of those who committed their very lives to that love, we renew our struggle to end racism in all forms. And we begin by taking time on Monday, January the 17th, to reread the letter from a Birmingham jail, along with the message from the Birmingham clergy that prompted Dr. King's letter, and to reflect on its meaning for us today. And we urge all within our churches to join us. You know, I think about that. There is a commission that's been set up in the Diocese of New York to look at racism. And one of the things at Diocesan Convention recently, a couple of weeks ago, they presented this very profound play. I'd never seen it before. It was written by the rector of St. James Hyde Park. And it's about the ways in which the Diocese of New York was directly involved in slavery. And it involves many of the important families that we honor in this community. And some of them were very much involved in the slavery movement and the churches that they blessed and supported and so on. But it's one of those things that's kind of buried and not talked about. The play is excellent. It's amazing. And it's a way in which we begin in our own history, in our own story, to look at the ways in which we have created the mountains and the valleys and the walls and the stony roads and the difficult path that is anti-gospel. And how do we heal that? How do we engage that? How do we talk about that? And so Advent is this opportunity for us as we are confronted with the larger-than-life image of John the Baptist as a kind of our own little wake-up call to racism. And what are we doing about that as those who are created in the image of God? How do we find our way home to ourselves and to God? And how do we bridge that gap? How do we get further on that journey? That is a difficult journey. And it is a wilderness. It is a wilderness. Those little steps of courage to leave what may be expected of us and venture into the future, where the mystery we call God is more powerful and more attractive than any other distraction. And like John's core message, to change the way we think about everything and everyone, how connected we really are to everything and everyone, and how eternal that is.